All right, here we are. Will and Rugmo back again discussing Atlas Shrugged on part 2, discussing the first half. What are your first impressions, Will?
This one was really intense. I loved reading this one. I say intense too much, but this one was really awesome. Like after the heated end to part one, I was pretty intrigued to see how they'd go forward with it. But we saw the falling apart of civilization with this communist sort of
Yeah.
government taking over and the destruction of leaders of industry and the struggles for them to survive. And some really good writing, some really good speeches,
For sure.
and it was overall really enjoyable to read.
Yeah, it opens off with the discussing the aftermath of
Oh yeah, so it was Dr. Ferris, right?
they
Not
both
to
work for
step on
the
your toes.
they both work for the Science Institute, right? I'm not sure his absolute title.
Yeah, and so Dr. Stadler used to be the guy. He was the face of the Science Institute, and it comes across his desk that there's this public publication of new philosophical theories that's been produced with his stamp, with his science institution, and it's the farthest thing from science and improvable and pointless and completely lapped up by the general population.
Yeah. Ferris at one point makes an argument that if anybody's actually stupid enough to believe this stuff, then that's what they deserve. And that's where Stadler really has a problem with it because like you're using my name in this book to manipulate people in such a way.
Yeah, I wish I had a quote from that section because it was pretty intense, and he was clearly quite torn up about it. And this is Dr. Ferris now just taking over control of the Science Institute and turning it into essentially a propaganda machine. Like they're not doing any science; they're just making propaganda to help enforce these, I guess, tariffs and restraints that are being put on industry, the fair share and resource distribution laws and legislature that they've come up with, and the public seems to love it.
Yeah, they've been making excuses for all the socialist policy that's come out as a result of the oil shortage and coal shortage and all the other industrial problems everyone's going through.
Actually, let me read this part because I think it sums up this chapter pretty good. So you think you're sure of your opinions? You cannot be sure of anything. Are you going to endanger the harmony of your community, your fellowship with your neighbors, your standing, reputation, good name, and financial security for the sake of an illusion, for the sake of the mirage of thinking that you think? Are you going to run risks and court disasters at a precarious time like ours by opposing the existing social order in the name of those imaginary notions of yours which you call your convictions? You say that you're sure you're right. Nobody is right, or ever can be. You feel that the world around you is wrong. You have no means to know it. Everything is wrong in human eyes. So why fight it? Don't argue. Accept. Adjust yourself. Obey. And that's
Yeah.
an excerpt from the book written by Dr. Floyd Ferris and published by the State Science Institute. And Dr. Robert Sadler is just appalled and can barely even look at the book, let alone do any work in his office, knowing that this book is in the public domain and that so many people are just falling in line like sheep and not questioning the government because it's the government and it's the State Science Institute, and they've postured themselves in a way that what they say is believed and what they say they believe, and what they do is destroy, and they completely destroy this country. They rip apart the United States of America. And at this point in time, all of these countries that they're talking about around the world are also turning into these welfare states and people's states. And what's happening is they get rid of these brilliant leaders of industry. Well, at least they've been staged to be brilliant leaders of industry that have the gumption to actually build a minefield, to build a foundry, to build a production plant, and they put all together this magnificent creation that has thousands of jobs. And the minute that they're gone, the people that try to replace them to keep going with this great business model don't have a flipping clue. And what happens is they can't get their resources and they can't meet their production quotas. And the butterfly effect is manifold, and it's logarithmic in scale. And a simple coal shipment taking an additional day to get to the trains holds up 60 freight carts of lettuce that rot by the time they get to New York. And as a result, people are starving and people are freezing. They can't heat their homes. They can't get food. They can't afford anything. And you see what happens in the midst of this downfall of society and economy and business when you remove the people that made things happen and pretend that you can keep them going as a public service. It's just miserable.
Yeah, there comes a certain point where, you know, the stereotypical evil corporation is a necessary staple in society, because all those people create not just jobs but material for every other business that they're connected to. And if they go under, then the chain reaction is endless.
And so, like, what we see is there's this fear, right, that a few people are monopolizing the market and they are making all the money. And you have these people with these ideals that say, well, that's not fair. Everybody should get their chance. And because they're so big, no little guy could ever do anything now. And we all have to go and work for this person who's done so well. But I want to make a foundry and there's no market left for me, the little guy. So we need to redistribute the wealth and we need everybody to have a chance. And what happens is that's not how it works. And it's just this optimistic, imaginary fantasy math ordeal that it looks great on paper that you could have multiple people all working and distribute the jobs in the business. But the minute you do that, you break apart the system that was created in this perfectly balanced way to have monopolies. And suck as it might, this capitalistic system succeeds in feeding the people and moving forward as a society. And the minute you try and break it down and steal pie from the rich, there's no pie left over.
Yeah, once everyone becomes Robin Hood and wants to steal from the rich and give to the poor, soon there's going to be no rich to steal from anymore.
And I just don't understand how people could think in this way, that because some groups of individuals have had great deals of success, that they aren't entitled to their success and they should feel guilty of their success because they did a good job and they did good deals and they made good business actions, that they should feel bad about themselves and feel guilty and unworthy of their success. And like, I'm very much being converted to a true believer in capitalism through this book. I thought I liked capitalism before, but I definitely love it now.
Yeah. Like that's a tricky one. Like, definitely in my younger days I had some things to say about capitalism, but it was really misguided in a lot of ways, and reading this book has been one of the things that helps me sort all that out.
I know for myself, I definitely want to read some more of Ayn Rand's books, because this is one of the last books she published. And obviously it's a great piece. I mean, it's pretty thick. Like, this Bible print 1,100 page book is an intense read, but it goes so easily because it's so well put together. And she's such a fantastic author. And the characters she builds are amazing. I love to read some of her more nonfiction and some of her other books, because I know, like, what I experience when I say, oh, I'm reading Atlas Shrugged, the next response is, oh, I love The Fountainhead. And it's like,
Yeah.
Well, I haven't read The Fountainhead. I'm reading Atlas Shrugged. But obviously, there's something to it. If all of these people are reading it, I definitely want to look into it.
I agree. And chapter 1 continues into the scene where Dagny has to reach out to Mr. Stadler, Dr. Stadler, to take a look at this motor that she found, because really there's no one else available. Like, she's exhausted all of her resources, and even though the last meeting she had with Dr. Stadler left a bad taste in her mouth, it's really the only option she has left to go to.
And they're excited about it, and it's hard for Dagny because there's no thinkers left, it seems like, in this country. There's no men of pure thought that have this ingenuity and problem solving ability. It's all just become so convoluted, and she thinks reaching out to Stadler will help her, but it turns out he's just become this crushed husk of a man that is trapped in a publicly funded institution, and he hasn't seen anyone capable of working on that motor in years.
But he has seen one person, and that's where it introduces a Mr. Quentin Daniels.
Yes. And so they start toiling away with the motor. We don't see much progress in this part towards a good end for the motor yet, but it certainly keeps us interested and curious about how that will play out.
And towards the very end of chapter 1, Hank takes out Dagny for dinner in a nice secluded restaurant so no one knows who they are. Hank is looking at everyone in the restaurant, and he sees that they're all just kind of going through the motions, and says, "Dagny, look at these people. They're supposed to be the playboys of life, the amusement seekers, the luxury lovers. They sit there waiting for this place to give them meaning, not the other way around. But they're always shown to us as the enjoyers of material pleasures, and then we're taught that enjoyment of material pleasure is evil. Enjoyment, are they enjoying it? Is there some sort of perversion in what we're taught, some error that's vicious and very important?" And Dagny replies, "Yes, Hank, very vicious and very important."
Yeah, that's a great quote, because that's just on the heels of Hank Reardon refusing to fill an order for the State Science Institute for his medal. And he's in his office and he's realizing that this really chunked up, value-based, high ideal conversational method that the socialists have of requesting, quote unquote, resources from industry leaders it's got a trap, and that trap is they're not using guns. They're not putting the leaders of industry up against a wall and taking by force all of their production. They're trying their very hardest to create a society where it is impossible to do business legally, and the moment you break a law, the socialist leaders will be there to hold that law over your head and blackmail you and make you do business. And Hank Reardon is resolute in his convictions that he will be of no part of this, and he will not help them, and he will not give them moral voluntary consent to take what he has built and steal it from him. And as a result, their entire plan of blackmail falls through. And so we move into the next chapter, which is the court scene, because they now, as a socialist government, have to use their laws to attempt to get a voluntary action out of a man who has no interest in performing this voluntary action of surrendering his resources and not making business with his business partners and his customers, but in fact providing all of his efforts to the government that he does not respect and does not value and has sought to completely destroy him.
Yeah. And it's really like what we were just talking about. They're not just seeking to destroy someone, they're making an example out of him to topple another one of these greedy corporations that socialism has no room for, because they need everyone to be equal in wealth and opportunity and everything else.
Yeah, and it's like every action of the socialist government we see in this part, and even on the heels of the last part that we read, is this conspiracy of action that not one action alone fixes any problem that is facing the government, but that they intend to use every single action and fault of leaders of industry to blackmail and persuade and coordinate, like this spider web of control that they're trying to weave to get to their end. And it doesn't work. What's happening is these leaders of industry are disappearing. They're retiring without a word, like we saw at the end of part 1 with Ellis Wyatt blowing up his oil field and disappearing off the face of the planet. And we had a few more in this part that just up and disappeared. They started to do successful business because the coal industry disappeared, and so they got all the business. And then within a couple months, they disappear and they retire, and the whole web is falling apart, and you're just seeing the destruction of economy and society, and it's absurd. And then right in the middle of it, with chapter 2, we have this, like, I want to think of a good word for it, but it's this crazy event, this wedding of James Taggart marrying the shop girl, Cheryl Brooks, that he met. And you have this juvenile leader of industry with socialist ideals. Like, he shouldn't have ever been in the position he's in, but because he was the son of the man who owned the largest train system in the country, he was, by virtue of air, able to be where he is, and he doesn't deserve it, and he's never done anything worth his salt, and it's always been his sister that's made him succeed. But he's this aristocrat who's highly respected by the socialist government and fully entrapped in their guilt and their blackmail and their favors and their friends, and constantly trying to do his best from his own set of ideals and perspective. And it's absolutely abhorrent. And they have this amazing high-class wedding right in the center of the destruction of the country, as though nothing bad is happening. We see the bourgeoisie partying away and celebrating this joining of two peoples.
Yeah, and you have all these really gross conversations between people like Lillian and Jim saying, oh yeah, we're good friends, but everything we say is a manipulation to try to pull one over on the other party.
Yeah, and you see Lillian really step into her character here. Before, she was just like, you always saw Lillian, the wife of Hank Reardon, as this woman who was a really, what's a family-friendly description for her? Obtuse, really obtuse individual, one that you could, if she wasn't even there and Hank was just a successful single man, you'd be like, all the power to you, Hank. But she's there and he's committed to her, and she's horrible and useless and a socialite, and she thinks that she's important and is concerned with who shows up at her party and what parties she goes to, and is just entrenched in this involuntary societal circus of social tea parties and shopping trips and not paying attention to anything that's actually happening in the country. And she now goes to this party and she steps up and she says to James Taggart, like, I brought my husband, and whenever you need him, you just say the word and I will make sure he's there, because I control my husband. Yeah. And now look, my husband's here at your party, which means he submits to you, and this social posturing is beneficial to you. You're welcome.
Yeah, they use social status as a means of currency. You're like, look who I attracted to your party. Now you're a big shot with big shot Hank Reardon here. And Francisco D'Anconia shows up too.
And you can't have all these people in one place with everything that's going on in the scenery in the background without expecting some sort of crazy good monologue, which is exactly what Francisco gave us. Do you have a favorite part of his monologue?
Well, I have one quote that's a response to, he overhears Jim saying that Money is the root of all evil. Go replies with, "Let me give you a tip on a clue to men's characters. The man who damns money has attained it dishonorably, and the man who respects it has earned it." That was the part that stuck out to me.
Um, yeah, so Francisco starts talking and making a bit of a scene, and some people start gathering around him. And Senor Denconio is asked by this large lady who nobody knows, just some random bystander, "What do you think is going to happen to the world?" And he says, "Just exactly what it deserves." And she says, "Oh, how cruel." He says, "Oh, don't you believe in the operation of the moral law?" "I do." And then Bertram Scudder, this, what is he, a columnist, I think. He's one of the newspapermen, or maybe an author
Some kind of
that's
philosopher.
in the socialist sphere. He says, "Don't let him disturb you. You know, money is the root of all evil, and he's the typical product of money." And it starts him on this tirade, this 5-page monologue, standing up for money as the root of all good. And I've got to share one paragraph of the 15 because it's beautiful. And he goes, "But you say that money is made by the strong at the expense of the weak? What strength do you mean? It is not the strength of guns or muscles. Wealth is the product of man's capacity to think. Then is money made by the man who invents a motor at the expense of those who did not invent it? Is money made by the intelligent at the expense of the fools? By the able at the expense of the incompetent? By the ambitious at the expense of the lazy? Money is made before it can be looted or mooched, made by the effort of every honest man, each to the extent of his ability. An honest man is one who knows that he can't consume more than he has produced." And I absolutely love it. And I'm going to end up writing this one out and thinking about it a great deal because it is so intense. You cannot digest his monologue in one sitting. And he posits that we live in a society that is grounded on the basis that men wish to exchange services, and that those services and products that they create have an inherent value that is recognized by all those people that are in the society, and that value is manifest in money. And that if you'd like to undermine a man's production, if you don't see the value in his product, then don't buy it.
Yeah.
And it's that easy. If the masses don't buy the thing they don't like, the thing they don't like will not have the value. And that the value of monopolies is not because of a bad man who's manipulated the world, but because he was a smart man who produced something the world needed and sold it at an agreed upon value. There was no extortion, no manipulation, no back alley deals of any nature, unlike this socialist society, which seeks to do just that, and without using guns, but with moral supremacy and higher ground idealistic thinking, try to extort and manipulate those people who have done good to do good for the country with no payment.
Yeah, and that's how you find, or at least that's a way of finding meaning in your life, is if you develop a product that many people need and want, then you have a reason to keep going. You got to keep producing. And then the government comes in and says, "Well, actually, this isn't for the good of everybody. We know better than you. So you can only sell so much to so many people. We're going to limit your production so everyone else has a chance." When really that hurts a lot more people than these socialists think they're helping.
Yeah, and it's just this misguided principle that the aristocracy of pull was the name of that chapter. And Francisco talks about the notion that you think that you can continue to make people do the things that they were content in doing for money with guilt and shame and blackmail, when it was the very system that was in place that gave people their morals. And now morals have transcended to this higher realm of philosophical bull caca. Family friendly. Keep it family friendly. It's really intense. And I didn't, going into this book, I thought, okay, I've heard this book a few times, maybe it's all right. But to see such intense, idealistic, philosophical debate in a fiction novel is breathtaking. It is so far from the books that I was forced to read in high school, and so far from the New York Times bestsellers and the books that have been turned into movies. And of course, this book was turned into a movie, and it's awful. It's just
I'll just take your
wonderful.
word on it. Just take
Oh,
your
we
word
won't
on
even,
that.
don't even waste your time. You'd have to read the book to understand the movie, and to read the book to understand the movie would destroy the movie, and it's just terrible. So we won't go there.
All right. On that note, let's take a little break. We'll be back right after these messages.
See you soon.
All right. Next on the chopping block is Chapter 3.
What happens? What are the highlights of Chapter 3? That one's called White Blackmail. This is where we lead into the court scene. So there was a reprieve in the wedding chapter before we get to the court scene, because it wasn't a simple matter.
Actually, at the very end of the wedding was when Francisco declared that his, stock is about to plummet, and then it creates a big chaotic kerfuffle at the end of the wedding.
Oh, yes.
And everyone starts going crazy because everyone has copper stocks with Danconia.
Yeah, so we see after Francisco explains just how important money is, he puts into place this giant series of events that completely plummet his own stock in his family company of copper that all of the socialists have been investing in under different names, because of course they shouldn't have money and they shouldn't be wasting their money and conserving their money and earning money, not in a socialist society. No. And they freak out because now their big money pig is torn at the chest and bleeding to death, and they have no recourse. There's nothing they can do to prevent this from happening, which again made me enjoy Francisco even more, because this is a man who saw the socialist movement happening all over the world and saw it coming to the United States, and knew right away that there'd be no opportunity for him to work in a capitalist society and do good work and make good money. And so he shifts and dedicates his life to some cause that is yet unknown to me, but in the short term is certainly screwing with every single socialist leader.
Yeah, and there's a conversation between Dr. Ferris and Hank Reardon in Reardon's office. And Floyd Ferris has a quote where he says, "Consistency is not a habit of mind which it is wise to practice or to expect of the human race." Which I really liked it. I don't like much of what Floyd has to say, but I like that one.
Yeah, that was a good quote too.
Yeah, just people are unpredictable. Learn to accept it, kind of thing. And then he eventually ends up trying to blackmail Hank a little bit more.
Well, so what happens is, like, we don't even get to the court scene until chapter 4, but this is the stage gets set because Hank Reardon refuses to comply with these laws, and he's still trying to help Dagny get her train working, because he knows that if the train doesn't stay afloat, then the whole country will starve to death. And so he tries to make a deal to sell metal to one of these leaders of industry, Ken Daniger, and the socialist movement gets wind of it and they attempt to extort him. And throughout this chapter, we see that he refuses again and it looks like he's going to have to go to court. And then we have the meeting of Francisco and Reardon at their mills, the Reardon mills, just before the end of the chapter and before Hank is destined for court. And we have the conversation, the title conversation, where Francisco is explaining to Hank that the only thing he's done wrong is accepting moral condemnation for his virtues. And despite his brilliant work, Reardon's made no profit on his medal, and all of these other socialists have received a fortune, and he's suffering. He's created the most amazing new type of metal to transform the nation and make it a better place. And from the onset, he's been up against a wall, and he's had no success, and he's felt guilty, and he's had hardships, and he's tried to sell his metal and improve the rail system and help the country, and he's not making a profit, and he's feeling terrible, and he's working all these days. And so Francisco talks about this, the Titan of Greek mythology who holds up the world, and he asks Reardon what he would say if he saw Atlas drained of strength, supporting the globe with the last of his energy and gasping in pain, and analogizing Hank as Atlas. And Reardon just turns the question back to him, and Francisco says, well, I'd tell Atlas to shrug, to stop trying. The world isn't doing anything for you. You're just bearing this load, and it's destroying you for no benefit.
Yeah, I think that's the first real clue you get into Francisco d'Anconia's pure motives. He's trying to derail everything because he's tired of holding up the world on his own shoulders.
Yeah, I think Francisco realized early on that there's no dealing with a socialist state. There's no negotiation, and he's decided with all of his intelligence, and he is quite intelligent. He is talked about as one of the star pupils of all of the great doctors of their time at all of the great universities. Francisco is a brilliant mind, and he's established that the only way to deal with a socialist state is to let it crumble. And he pleads with supposedly many leaders of industry and says, stop, just let them crumble apart. Stop doing your best to work in a situation that is not possible to be survived. Just take a step back. I don't know where they're going, all these leaders of industry that are retiring and disappearing, but they're going somewhere, and they're waiting for the fallout to settle.
Yeah. And towards the end of their conversation, there's an accident at the factory. There's a big metal leak, and Reardon and Francisco both end up effectively saving the factory just on their
Yes,
own.
and they do it in a way that's banned. The only way that it could be dealt with has been banned as an unsafe practice, and the two of them fight against a pouring amount of liquid steel that's completely destroying the factory, and they stop it. They dam up the furnace, and
Yeah, they grab a couple shovels and clog the hole the old-fashioned way.
And this was like Francisco was just about to ask Reardon something, and I think the question he would have asked him would have stopped Hank from continuing. But after seeing this action and Hank in a situation of complete crisis and being the only man to make a difference, he did everything in his power, risking his life to save his factory. And that was enough for Francisco to not finish his question because he'd learned his answer.
And there's one point where Frisco was about to fall into the lava, and then Hank just pulls him out of the way and says, "Oi, be careful." And towards the end of the chapter, he says, "Hey, Hank, you saved my life." And Hank just responds with, "You saved my factory."
Yeah.
So you see their relationship build even more. And this is also the chapter where Lillian catches Hank in his affair.
Yes. How did she go about it? Was that?
She was talking to his secretary, and she said, well, he'll be arriving at New York, so-and-so train. And she calls the
train to send him flowers.
Yeah, she calls,
and they say, oh, he's not on this train.
And then she's like, well, I'll have to go meet him, because she knows that he's there. But she knows that he's also on somebody else's car. And she's like, well, this is perfect. I've had my suspicions of him cheating on me this whole time. Now is the perfect opportunity to go find out who it is. And then she sees Dagny there. It all falls into place.
And it's such a perverse relationship, and you see it again in this chapter where Hank is accepting all of this crap that there's just no need for. He could divorce his wife at any moment, but he made this vow till death do us part, and she knows he's cheating on her, and she doesn't want a divorce. She wants to try and make him suffer, and he does not value her opinion in any capacity, and her being upset is her tool in which she wishes to inflict him damage, and it has no impact on him because he does not care in any capacity about this woman who is just toxic for him and absolutely abusive and useless.
And she uses this as like a poker chip. Just kind of, oh, now I have one more piece of blackmail on you. You have to do even more things that I request of you, or I'm going to make your life even more miserable, or I'll let everyone know that you're not the perfect, immaculate human that everybody thinks you are. And she uses their relationship and sex and love as a business transaction in the worst kind of way.
It is quite despicable, I think is the word for it, and very enjoyable to read.
It's really a good example of how not to act in your relationship. If you're doing any of these things, just stop.
Yeah. And Ayn Rand actually in interviews talks about how a good relationship ought to work, and it is far from what she is demonstrating in this relationship. I think she's giving the antithesis to her point to demonstrate just how toxic it can get when you don't care about your partner. And I think because again, she talks about the virtue of selfishness, Ayn Rand does, and that you should be with someone for selfish reasons, not to make them feel better, but to make yourself feel better because you're with such a good person.
Yeah, it's much more productive to have two separate individuals in a relationship because they both want to be in it, because they're both getting something out of it, than two people trying to just get a little bit more out of the other person.
Yeah.
And like sacrifice their happiness for something that you wanted, or force them to sacrifice something just for you. It should be all self-sacrifice and not like asking anything of the other person. You should be selfish but not entitled in a relationship.
Yes. All I want to talk about is the court scene in chapter 4. I'm so excited about this. Another great monologue. Are we there yet? Can I talk about it?
The only thing before that, I think, is the Thanksgiving dinner, which is just unbearable.
Yeah, so again, we see Hank is now at the point where he's done taking everybody's crap and is done with the pretense and done being a victim that is subjected to the torment of his family being upset with him for not being the person he is supposed to be in their eyes, and the all-giving, all-forgiving provider of bourgeoisie wealth and freedoms, and they're just these leeches. And he's done with his brother, and he doesn't give a damn about his brother, who's been doing nothing but pushing the socialist movement as best he can and using Hank's money to do it.
Yeah, and he pretty much all but kicks him out. He says, if you want to go, go. But deep down he knows that he's not going anywhere because he needs him. Even though he talks big and says, oh, if I could, I would. But we all know he's too selfish.
But from this day forward, his brother knows now that he is not here because his brother wants him to be, and that he is in his brother's house, and he will not be able to treat his brother that way anymore.
Yeah. And right after that, right after the Thanksgiving dinner, there's a small interaction with Eddie and Hank that I really liked, where Eddie Willers was saying, hey man, I really support what you're doing here. I hope your trial goes well. Hank says, this is what we're going to do. The exact same thing that I'm getting in trouble with Ken Daniger, I'm going to do for you. Because I can't stand the system anymore.
So after refusing to give the State Science Institute medal, he gets caught in an illegal situation, and he's confronted, and he's been told that the system is designed that people break the laws, and when they're caught breaking the laws, they're blackmailed to get other people to do what they want and to do what they want. And Hank says point blank, no, I'm not doing that. You'll have to take me to court. And he gets to the court, and we're in the court chapter 4, part 2, and he does not recognize the court as a legal body. He does not recognize the laws of the government. He does not recognize any of it. And again, the socialist movement without guns is trying to force a voluntary commitment from Hank to say that he's guilty, to admit that he's wrong, but he's not, and not by his standard. And we get into this back and forth of them completely out of cards because they can't force his hand, and he's saying, force my hand, but don't pretend that you're not forcing my hand. Use guns and seize my property. If that's what you want, do it. Don't pretend that you're doing anything different.
Yeah, and the judge asks, are we to understand that you hold your own interests above the interests of the public? And he replies with, I hold that such a question can never arise except in a society of cannibals.
Yeah, I'm just going to do a little excerpt from his really big monologue that gets the whole courtroom to cheer. But he says, I shall answer all the questions you are afraid to ask me openly. Do I wish to pay my workers more than their services are worth to me? I do not. Do I wish to sell my product for less than my customers are willing to pay me? I do not. Do I wish to sell it at a loss or give it away? I do not. If this is evil, do whatever you please about me, according to whatever standards you hold. These are mine. I am earning my own living as every honest man must. I refuse to accept as guilt the fact of my own existence and the fact that I must work in order to support it. I refuse to accept as guilt the fact that I am able to do it and do it well. I refuse to accept as guilt the fact that I am able to do it better than most people, the fact that my work is of greater value than the work of my neighbors, and that more men are willing to pay me. I refuse to apologize for my ability. I refuse to apologize for my success. I refuse to apologize for my money. If this is evil, make the most of it. If this is what the public finds harmful to its interests, let the public destroy me. This is my code, and I will accept no other.
Yeah.
Oh, and it just doesn't stop there, and it doesn't start there, and it's wonderful.
You definitely need to read this book, full stop.
There's one book you read this year, it's Atlas Shrugged. Read this book and get some perspective. And I'm not saying this is the right perspective. I'm sure we'll dip into more perspectives, but let me tell you, this one's in the lead right now.
For me, I like to combine perspectives. Copy them, find the best of each of them, find the system that works for you that way. But I'm getting a lot out of this objectivism. And to bring it back to the Socrates conversations, you really see Hank as the social gadfly.
Yes.
In this chapter.
Oh, absolutely. He is at the center of the universe right now. He is saying that this is wrong, and he is doing it in a public court, and he is ensuring the world knows what is going on. And I think he's opening people's eyes, at least briefly, to the reality that they're living in. And by this point, have they already cut off all of the tops of the towers because they're so low on energy that they can't afford to allow people to run businesses above the 30th floor? Or is that the next chapter?
I think that's the beginning of chapter 5 when it talks about winter coming early.
Right. And so you see, like, all of these things are happening, and Hank is pointing it out that this is not right, and the propaganda won't publish it. They don't talk about the court hearing at all.
Mm-hmm. And there's one quote at the very end of the trial when they've established that all they can really do is fine him $5,000, and he gets away with everything else. And he says, well, if this is what's beaten us, then the guilt is ours, which falls more into Hank's personality of just the guy that takes complete ownership for everything. But he sees where society has faltered, in that they've just let the government take from them without any force or anything.
The other great part of this chapter, I wonder if we could find the quote. in chapter 4 is the again, another great conversation with Francisco and Hank Reardon about the nature of sex.
Yeah, he says something like, "Love is our response to our highest values."
Yeah,
I had that quote right.
I think I have it here. Did it ever occur to you that it's the same issue? The men who think that wealth comes from material resources and has no intellectual root or meaning are the men who think, for the same reason, that sex is a physical capacity which functions independently of one's mind, choice, or code of values. They think that your body creates a desire and makes a choice for you just about it in some such way as if iron ore transformed itself into railroad rails of its own volition. Love is blind, they say. Sex is impervious to reason and mocks the power of all philosophers. But, in fact, a man's sexual choice is the result and the sum of his fundamental convictions. Tell me what a man finds sexually attractive, and I will tell you his entire philosophy of life. Show me the woman he sleeps with, and I will tell you his valuation of himself. No matter what corruption he's taught about the virtue of selflessness, sex is the most profoundly selfish of all acts, an act which he cannot perform for any motive but his own enjoyment. Just try to think of performing it in a spirit of selfless charity, an act which is not possible in self-abasement, only in self-exaltation, only in the confidence of being desired and being worthy of desire. It is an act that forces him to stand naked in spirit as well as in body, and to accept his real ego as his standard of value. He will always be attracted to the woman who reflects his deepest vision of himself, the woman whose surrender permits him to experience, or to fake, a sense of self-esteem. The man who is profoundly certain of his own value will want the highest type of woman he can find, the woman he admires, the strongest, the hardest to conquer, because only the possession of a heroine will give him the sense of an achievement, not the possession of a brainless slut. He does not seek to, and it trails off. He does not seek to gain his value, he seeks to express it.
Yeah. And the entire time that he's saying that, you have to just read into it like all the wheels turning in Hank's head. He's thinking about Dagny the whole time. And the entire time Francisco is making the speech, probably thinking about the same woman.
Yeah.
Like, Francisco is basically telling Hank why he's having this affair and why he feels the way he does. And he's just sitting there like, yeah, you're right. This is exactly how I feel.
And that was the one thing Dagny did best in this whole book thus far, is to not tell Hank who she'd been with in the past, which was, of course, Francisco, because they become... Yeah. It's such a weird toxic triangular relationship that if either knew, it would throw an imbalance to the whole thing.
Yeah, we definitely wouldn't have been able to see the growth in relationship between Francisco and Hank if that was standing in the middle of it.
Yeah, and it is...
There's a point when Hank asks him too, is just like, so this girl that you're thinking about, have you lost her? And he just looks off into the distance and says, well, I hope.
Yeah. And that was an intense paragraph. The very nature and basis of his argument about values and ego in relationship to sexual partners was quite the mind boggle for me. I was very intrigued by it.
Yeah, I liked it a lot. I think it's got a lot to offer for anybody trying to be in a stable relationship, not just a fling.
Well, and it comes full circle back to the notion that you need to know who you are. Yes. And what you want before you go out and start doing and acting and clinging to ideals. You cannot just adopt any sort of hat in this world before knowing what your head looks like. And that's just lovely. It really is. This whole book ties in really nicely with the dialogues of Socrates that we've been reading and talking about, this whole notion of who you are and what you want and what you do and how you do it and why you do it, and the very nature of existence and purpose. It's nice to have the philosophical dialogues and the back and forth of the Socratic meaning behind people's intentions, and then this beautiful story with metaphors and comparisons that really get across this point that there is a level of understanding. There is a factual layer of existence. And if you neglect logic and reason, you will suffer.
Yeah, absolutely. That leads us to the beginning of chapter 5 when winter comes early in late November, which was kind of funny to read as a Canadian.
Yeah.
Late November is an early winter? Okay.
Yeah. That it is funny seeing New York people suffering in their long, cold winter that's 4 months long, having just come off the heels of a 9-month winter.
Yeah. But of course, there's the added factor of the coal shortages, the oil shortages, which effectively takes up business all across the country. People die in the cold because they can't afford warmth. There's lots of snow, so it cuts off the Taggart train lines. A bridge collapsed in Mississippi. All kinds of terrible things are happening. And you have Francisco carrying out his plan, and it's explaining that Ragnar the pirate is sinking every single copper shipment that comes from Danconia Copper, every steel shipment that comes from Associated Steel, including one that goes all the way to Germany as a relief effort. They have to help out Germany.
I need you to give me your 2 cents on this whole situation, because like while all this is going on, in the background we have this pirate, and I've yet to understand the higher purpose of his role here, because he's just going around looting every single ship that comes out of a nation going somewhere. He's destroying them, he's sinking them, he's capturing them, and it's like,
it doesn't even say that he captures them for himself, though. He just sinks them to the bottom of the ocean.
well, he sinks every copper ship, but he takes all of the food.
Okay, yeah. Which I think is a bit of a hint towards that one of the John Galt stories that we've heard.
Yeah.
So I think my fan theory is that Ragnar and Francisco are all in on this together.
Oh, absolutely. I think
along with a third student from Stadler and Axton.
And I think that third student is John Galt.
I couldn't agree more. To the conversation with Dagny and Stadler, where Stadler claims that I knew a John Galt once, but he couldn't be alive now. If he was, the whole world would be talking about him. And Dagny just looks at him and says, the whole world is talking about him.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think we're going to see some really crazy waves get created in the next few chapters, and certainly part 3. I think it's really going to turn into a story we were and weren't expecting, because they're setting the stage for something much bigger than this social crisis. The socialist government destroying the United States is not where our story ends. And I think, and I hope that it's a really good ride.
And there's one more meeting with all the higher-ups at Taggart Transcontinental, and they decide to just kill the John Galt line, scrap it all for parts, because now that Wyatt Oil is out of the picture, there's really no need for a track across the country leading to Wyatt Oil.
Yeah, so we're at that point where now the John Galt line has died, and it is again we have Francisco coming in, third act, to have that conversation with Dagny about the death of her baby.
Yeah, and there's just one more paragraph that I want to read, if we can end on it.
Yes.
About one of the final explanations of who is John Galt from Francisco d'Anconia himself. He says, I can answer, he said. I can tell you who is John Galt. Really, everybody seems to know him, but they never tell the same story twice. He says, they're all true, though. All the stories you've heard about him. Well, what's yours? Who is he? John Galt is Prometheus who changed his mind. After centuries of being torn by vultures in payment for having brought to men the fire of the gods, he broke his chains, and he withdrew his fire. Until the day when men withdrew their vultures.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, all of these John Galt metaphors are just beautifully poetic.
Well, like I said, this book ought to be read, and I highly recommend it to anyone interested, because this is such a good experience. And there's more drama, of course, in this chapter, and we could rave and rant about it all, but it doesn't capture the whole beautiful story. I mean, it really is quite enjoyable. I'm so glad we've recorded this episode and we're recording this episode because I'm just ready to dive in and finish this part and finish this book.
Yes, it's been quite the ride so far, and I can't wait to see what's coming up. Until next time, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, tell us what you think. May the force be with you.
And may the force be equal to mass times acceleration.